The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Early last year, I was invited onto the Libertarian Christian Institute Podcast to have a conversation about politics and anarchism. We end up going over some great points that seem to constantly come up in our discussions. So if you're new to this podcast, or Christian anarchism in general, this might be a great episode to get into some of the basic tenets within the ideologies that we discuss. A lot of what we touch on seems to continue back to this theme of consistency and pragmatism, which I think is always the case when someone is starting down this libertarian, voluntarist, or anti-state path. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Doug Stewart from the Libertarian Christian Institute Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm your host, Doug Stewart, and I have another podcast host with us today, Stephen from the Anarcho-Christian Podcast, a wonderful podcast that I bet a lot of you listeners of this podcast listen to. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So I thought it would be really cool to just have a conversation with another libertarian Christian and another person who sees the world, the way we do. And just, I think we often fail to realize that people have stories, and it sometimes takes people a long time to get to their views. Sometimes it takes not so long, depending on what they are and what kind of convinces them. But we all have stories, and I wanted you to come on to tell us your story, and we're going to kind of have a conversation. We'll share each other's stories. That way your listeners can hear on your podcast if they're interested in the Libertarian Christian Podcast. Maybe they don't even know about us. Be a good kind of back and forth conversation, just kind of get to know each other and how we became libertarian / anarchists. I guess we'll get that more defined as we have this conversation. So the way that I always ask people this question is, have you always been a libertarian? And if you weren't always a libertarian, when did you become one?
Yeah, that is a good question. And unfortunately, I have not always been a libertarian. I've grew up, I guess, as far back as I can remember, actually having an opinion on things. It was very neocon, very Republican, right-wing, that sort of thing, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners probably come from the same background. But as far as what, really kind of swayed me out of that would be just looking at the state of things in the neocon and, right-wing propaganda groups like Fox News and things like that. And then just kind of starting to evaluate that against, things that we hold as morals and our Christian morals. And then also just the rhetoric, kind of comparing the rhetoric that we say to what we actually believe and what we would actually act on. Coming from that right-wing perspective, a big term is a constitutionalist. So, of course, I considered myself a constitutionalist. And then when you start looking at some of the things that happen politically and comparing that to your beliefs, when you're honest about it, it becomes very hard to continue to back those actions from politicians or the president. We have even recent examples of that going on right now where, you have people approving of things that the president has done, and then others saying, well, look, this isn't constitutional, and kind of this fight back and forth. And I'd say The joke about converting from a libertarian to an anarchist is 6 weeks, right? Or 6 months, and so it's very similar to that. Once I started going down that route from the constitutionalist, I became a libertarian. I guess maybe a big L libertarian at that point, but just the transition at that point was very quick, and just moved right into what I would consider libertarianism, fully recognized, and that is anarchism, which I know is a scary word, and maybe some of the listeners aren't aware of, I guess, that understanding of anarchism being the fully realized understanding of small L libertarianism. Mm-hmm. But it's a good conversation to have, and like you said, with sharing stories and things like that, most of this stuff comes off kind of scary at first, with the way that terms are thrown around and on social media and stuff like that with anarchism and what we kind of assume that it means. Yeah. And but once you start having those conversations and those stories and getting into philosophical concepts that are all kind of within that idea, I think it comes off a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, just you saying that those terms could be scary for people, it made me think about this as with my journey. I hadn't really thought about it until just a few moments ago. I don't think those terms ever really scared me because I didn't really care. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't care what terms it was. I sought out to find a way to answer the question, how is my faith expressed politically? If it should be at all. And it could be, sort of like the Anabaptist, stay away kind of, I can't think of the word right now, but the be absent of politics. It could be that. I've dabbled in that, from time to time. But the question, how's my faith expressed politically? I was just looking for the truth. I didn't really notice the labels per se until I was a little bit further along and realized that, oh, that's what this is called. So those words get thrown around, and, I think people think of anarchy as like synonymous with chaos. And I think, the dictionary term, I'm sure they're the thesaurus, I'm sure they're connected. But, in terms of, what we call anarcho-capitalism is, we don't mean disorder. So I think most of our listeners are familiar with that. From being a constitutionalist, how did you make the jump between that, or the transition from that to a libertarian? Because I think a lot of people who would call themselves constitutionalists would call themselves libertarians. I would probably put Glenn Beck in that category. Mm-hmm. But it's like they're not even, forgetting that anarchism is possibly the full expression of libertarianism apply to every single place. But I think a lot of people think that of constitutionalism. It's like, oh, well, this is a type of libertarianism too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you will see, I think Glenn Beck even used that term, and it is actually kind of humorous. We're coming into the next election season, right? And something that will be funny is watching Glenn kind of jump back and forth. He did it last time. He's done it before, where he's going to jump back and forth between this rah, Republican patriot sort of guy, and then this libertarian who just wants to leave people alone. And, maybe it is a morally conflicting idea, but, maybe we should leave them alone. You'll see him go back and forth with that. And, and even with libertarianism, there's a lot of baggage that comes with that term too, like anarchy. But
do you ever feel like just abandoning all labels? Like, do you just ever want to give them up because of the baggage?
I guess not, because labels are important. We're communicating, right? We have language, and sometimes we do have to kind of fix our definitions. But I mean, right now we've been talking for a few minutes, and can you imagine if we started this whole thing out and I had to give you the entire list of every position that I held on every single nuance, and so I can wrap all those things up into anarchism. And now I might have to fix the definition of how you or the listener understands anarchism, but I think that's probably going to be a little bit shorter of a discussion than going through every single nuance of what I believe in every situation. And, and then the conversation ends up being, well, what about this part? And what about that part? And, and then we can kind of attack those things as they come.
And we'll be losing listeners along the way if we just keep diving into semantic discussions.
Yes,
yeah. I mean, because that's the thing. It's like, I think it was Tom Woods who said something along the lines of like, what was it? It had to do with like, if Ron Paul and Glenn Beck are both considered libertarian, I heard this years ago, then that word has no meaning. Like, I mean, that, ironically, it's because of Glenn Beck that I got into Ron Paul at all.
Sure.
And eventually into like the Mises Institute, the Austrian school, way of thinking. So thanks to Glenn Beck, I'm a libertarian, like a real one, not a fake one or whatever. It's funny. You actually know what Glenn Beck is up to lately. I mean, like the last time I listened to or watched anything from Glenn Beck, he did not have white hair, which I'm pretty sure is a long time ago. So I don't know how old Glenn is doing.
I pay attention to all of the politics and stuff like that. And, sometimes it drives you crazy, but, I still pay attention to it. I still listen to the talking heads and guys that are on, the Republican or libertarian perspective, that maybe I wouldn't consider actually libertarian or, following it to its logical conclusion or anything like that. I still listen to them. I still pay attention. I still like hearing the conversations that people have about it.
So from constitutionalist to libertarian,
right.
A few months, a year, a couple of years. What was that transition like?
I think it was pretty quick because
they're not that far away.
They're really not. And growing up already kind of in that perspective of, the Republican stuff, you've already got all that language there, like liberty and the Constitution and freedom and all that sort of stuff, which can have different perspectives and different definitions depending on where you come from. But all that stuff's already kind of there. So it's really just fixing your definition so that it's consistent. So I go into it, thinking, yeah, I love liberty. Well, what does liberty actually look like? Does it look like, all of these laws that we have and all of these victimless crimes and things like that? Well, no, it doesn't. Maybe I don't like some of these things. Maybe they're morally questionable, but having laws against it, well, that doesn't look like liberty to me. That doesn't look like a strict definition of liberty. Then you start becoming more consistent, right? And then you apply it to things like the Constitution, and you say, well, I don't think it's right for this piece of paper to give someone the authority over someone else for a victimless crime or the ability to confiscate land and confiscate money and property. So I'm then getting more and more into the Lysander Spooner camp of things, where I'm not giving the Constitution that sort of holy standing, as some sort of sacred text. And from there, it just becomes being more and more consistent, not necessarily with a piece of text like the Constitution and the way that I'm kind of looking at it, but just being more consistent with the philosophy of liberty and things like that.
Have you ever noticed that constitutionalists who call themselves libertarians, and again, I'm not saying they're not libertarian because they very well may really value the Constitution, but do you ever notice that they're in conversations with people like you and me, and we say things like the Constitution is wrong, and they like tilt their head and look at you like, what do you mean? Like, it's almost as if they believe, again, I'm projecting my thoughts here, so I'm not accusing anybody, but it's almost as if they believe that libertarianism couldn't exist without the founding fathers of the United States.
Sure. Yeah.
Like it started there. And if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have any libertarian philosophy at all.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it really does kind of show the way that we're brought up with not even understanding where Thomas Jefferson got his ideas from, and when you do start getting into that and looking at the history of Locke and Smith and all those guys, and it becomes a much bigger conversation. It becomes a much bigger concept than, 1776, and that's kind of where it all starts right there. Yeah. But also to be fair, we were all there at some point. Most people are not born into anarchism or consistent libertarianism or however we want to phrase it. Most people are not born into that. and we do have to come out of it. And so, like we started this conversation, I was not at all where I am. I was far from where I am, when I was younger. So I try to be charitable and use the things that I've learned and the steps that I took going this direction, try to use that to then have a conversation where instead of arguing, you can walk people through your philosophy.
Yeah. Have you convinced anybody in your family, like your wider family, to join you in your journey to freedom?
Yeah, I'd say that I have. But it wouldn't be, I guess, solely me, where we just had this conversation and we came from two different perspectives and I completely thoroughly changed them. I think that the people within my family that we do have, similar opinions or the same opinions, we're all kind of going that way together. I think just looking at the way that social issues and political issues, the way that those issues have kind of been trending over the last decade,
Mm-hmm.
I think we were already kind of moving that direction.
Yeah. I find it, with family, for me, my side of the family and I have my wife's side of the family, we live near them, and they are a little bit more amenable to my views. My side of the family is more like, we don't really talk about it too much. My father is pretty sentimental about the United States and very patriotic. And, when I really get to know why he is that way, it's all really solid reasons that we would be like, we'd nod our heads and hear his stories and be like, oh, okay, we know why you love your country. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. And it's not he's a godly man and he's not worshiping the state, right? It's not that sort of blind faith or whatever. Now, I have disagreements with him about certain things. We did not vote for the same people, but at the same time, we're on different sides of the spectrum. So, we just don't talk about it. I get few conversations with the other side of the family, from time to time, and they want to know, what's the libertarian angle on things, and this is just making it broader to like people who just know that you're a libertarian. They're like, oh, hey, like I met somebody. They're like, oh, it was it was 2016. They're like, oh, you have someone to vote for this year. Like talking about Gary Johnson. I'm like, well, I mean, I could have voted for someone last time too. Like I had Ron Paul in 2008 or 2012, I guess 2008 as well. But I could have written, I don't even know what I did in 2008 now that I'm thinking about it. But anyway, I always have someone to vote for. It's like, but she meant like, oh, you have a major candidate. So it's like this thing that made the news that there's like a candidate that we could vote for. And like the extent to which most people think about politics is electoral politics. And I'm going to guess, and we can talk about this, that you think that engagement in politics is way more broad than just like the electoral politics that most people think of when you say the word being political.
Yeah. I think that there's a few, different things that we can consider being political if we're just being activist or if we're, voting to change it from the inside. And of course I have my personal beliefs as to what's actually legitimate and what's actually going to work and which isn't much. But when it comes to voting and when it comes to participating, I do take a very moral stance there, which I think a lot of the politics tends to trend that way when we talk. But, just knowing that you can't vote for the lesser of two evils, and we hear that all the time, and we can't let that be our determining factor. We can't let that be our guidance on how we're going to do things. We've got to look at it from a more consistent angle. And if we're talking within the Christian context here, I don't think that Christians should be voting for an evil at all. So I think that there's a good discussion to be had with voting for defensive reasons. I understand that. I understand voting in local elections for different taxes and stuff that are going to be levied in your county or in your city. I understand those things. But when it comes to voting and talking politics, most people are just concerned with the major presidential election every 4 years. And with that, I think that there's always a possibility of having somebody try to run that's consistent with all that stuff, but it's few and far between. And like the comment that you just had, people look at someone being able to get on the ballots as that being sort of legitimizing that person's stance, when really it should just be the consistency to our rhetoric. So I hope that answered your question. Sometimes I tend to ramble a little bit. But Doug, I am interested in, your opinion. I know you've been doing this for a little while. You've talked to a lot of people. What are some of your opinions on, just being involved in politics or just voting and, those sorts of things that are part of the conversation here?
Yeah. I mean, I do vote, but my reasons for voting have to do with social capital. And, I do freelance work, but I have one client where I work closely with this one person, and she's like really big into voting, and she's Republican and she's pretty proud about it, but she's really into voting. You'd think she is like, people on the left are like voting, super important. Like she's big like that. And she asked me one time, she's like, well, did you vote? And I'm like, well, it wouldn't do me any good. Like, it wouldn't change anything. Like, if I had stayed home versus going, there's no difference in the outcome. And she just looks at me befuddled, and she's all frustrated. And eventually, when I told her I actually went, I tell her all these like reasons why it's just like irrelevant for me to vote. Like, it doesn't matter. I actually am endangering people by putting more traffic on the road because I would have to drive to my polls. I could be more effective using, spending time with my kids. I actually don't know any of the candidates really well because this is a midterm election or whatever the reasons might be. And then she's like, well, did you vote? And I'm like, well, yeah, I went. I voted. And she's like, well, why did you vote if you told me all that you just told me? And I'm like, well, honestly, it's just easier to tell people I voted than to take all this time to explain to them why I didn't. And it seriously is like on my way home from work or whatever. The poll's not that far away. So it's like literally just pulling off the side of the road. It's usually not that busy. It takes me like all of 7 minutes, and it's like, whatever. So I humorously do it so that I don't have to explain to people why I don't. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but I have no pretense that what I'm doing changes things. I do get in the voting booth and I think, oh, this is kind of nice to vote for Libertarian. Like last time I voted straight Libertarian ticket in the midterm. It was a midterm. So it's kind of nice to do that. But do I think anything's changing? No. I think what I am put on this earth to do is raise my kids, influence the people that are in my church. They use the Greek word oikos, which is like the 8 to 15 people that you have like strong ties to. So I was about to use that word, and we were talking about language earlier, and I'm like, well, I don't know how many people would have known if I'd thrown out the word oikos, but that's a really good word. But anyway, influence the people that I have influence on and make the world a better place. I mean, I have a moral obligation, I think, to do the best amount of good that I can. And if going to the polls takes away from that, to be an informed citizen, it might take me more than just the 7 minutes I mentioned to just pull over and vote. So maybe I was making a morally poor choice, but, I don't think so, because I'm fairly well informed. But I think for Christians, see, I have always had a hard time. I wouldn't say a hard time, but I've always found it that all the things that I think about as a libertarian, I can't separate that from my Christianity. It's just tough to do. I mean, I grew up in the church. I grew up in a way that, like there were morals that you uphold, and I still hold on to like almost like most of them, I would say. And I don't mean like individual behavior morals, but like there are things that which God expects of us. Like God expects us to treat each other with love. God expects us to treat each other nonviolently. God expects, things from us. And so when I think of obligations to other people in society, I think some of that gets sneaked in. My Christian side of things gets sneaked in when I talk about things from a libertarian perspective. So sometimes when I'm arguing with people who don't buy into the Christian values, I have a hard time switching to non-Christian libertarian argumentation. But in any case, I would say that as Christians, I think it's pretty important that we engage our world in such a way that this sounds pretty cliche, but like we leave it a better place. And I think that we and that's like the soft version of it, right? The harder version is, how do we build for the kingdom, as Tom Wright would put it? How do we build for the kingdom that we're here to preach? How do we establish God's will on earth as it is in heaven? Because there's so much that we can be doing that is just about ourselves, that is just about like me and my little space. And I think the libertarian argument of rugged individualism, or maybe not rugged, I wouldn't even put that on it, but like even just individualism is important. But at the same time, there is a togetherness aspect that we have to acknowledge. And I think libertarians would be served well to talk about that. And I think that I'm a libertarian for the sake of other people. And I mean that in a couple ways. One is, I call myself a libertarian. Like I'm not against, I'll use a specific item here instead of rambling on with trying to be abstract about it. I'm going to violate a principle here and say that I don't personally, I mean, I do and I don't, but like, it's not the biggest thing in the world for me to write that check on April 15th to pay my taxes. But you know what is really important to me is that there are people in this world who have to pay taxes that shouldn't have to pay taxes. And I mean, that's everybody. Okay. So don't get me wrong. I don't want anybody to pay taxes, but like, I don't want to be paying the government so that it can rob other people of things. Okay. If what I'm paying for, so to speak, by writing a tax check is things that we would like typically economists would call like public goods and stuff. Okay, that's a very tiny portion of what we would actually be paying for. But what I'm really writing that check for is to actually harm other people. And that's the reason why I don't like those things. So so that's one thing. It's like I'm a libertarian for the sake of other people. And then there's the broader thing. It's like, well, I'm a libertarian because I know that poor people need freer markets than they're getting. Mm-hmm. And it's not really about me. Like I can personally suffer the tax burden, but other people cannot suffer the burden of government. Maybe that's probably the like most succinct way of putting it. And so like I'm not well off, but I'm fortunate enough to be blessed in life to where I don't feel like I have to worry where my next meal is coming from or anything like that. And so there are people in the world who don't have that luxury and security, and the government in so many ways is prohibiting them from improving their own lives, or they're actively, keeping them pressed down. So anyway, that's kind of like my take on it. It's like, I want to be a libertarian because there is a leave me alone aspect to it for me, but I see it as sort of like an outpouring of my calling to live in the world in such a way that it enhances the lives of others too.
Yeah, I think that definitely gets right into that conversation of what is going to help the poor, what is going to be better for society and all that stuff. Is it government? Is it voluntary interactions with each other? And yes, I 100% agree that, voluntary interactions with each other will be better. It will provide better to you and the ones around you and people that are impoverished. And then also I started thinking about the other aspect of that. And it's just the idea of government as coercive at all. And, when we say that we don't mind it if the government were to actually provide those resources or those things for the people who need it. So there's the one aspect of how can it be done better. But then there's also the other aspect of, should this be coerced at all? Mm-hmm. And that's really where I think I come from with a lot of my feelings and my discussions on it, is that it shouldn't be coerced at all. Even if you could give me a story of how the government has provided, X% better this or that, and we could get into a whole conversation of how it could be provided better in the private market. But I'm probably going to get stuck in that conversation of it shouldn't be coerced at all. It should be voluntary interactions. At no point, especially if we're going to call ourselves Christians, should we be forcing people to give up their wealth and their property and their lives because the government says so, because we, acting on behalf of the government, says so.
Yeah, I think the question of how do we live together is like, it kind of touches on this. It's like, well, you talk about, you're in a group of people, maybe you're stranded on an island and you're always going to be together and you're going to have to proliferate this island and you got to come up with laws, et cetera, et cetera. And you think, well, what's the best way to do this? And you think, oh, well, we should use a little bit of violence and make people do certain things because, well, I just know that if we don't make people do X, Y, and Z or whatever, then we won't have a functioning society. And like, on the face of it, it's like, well, that's a terrible way to look at things. Like,
right.
Like, do you really want violence? And yet at the same time, I've had conversations with full blown, like, well, I wouldn't call them consistent, but full blown pacifists. Like they believe in nonviolence in a personal way, in a national way, et cetera. And as a libertarian, I'll say things like, well, you're not really a pacifist because you actually believe that the government should harm people who disobey the laws that you think should be enforced. And they just are like, that's not the way it works. Like, because democracy, I mean, that's really like
right.
the answer. It's like, well, because you have a right to vote or the opportunity to vote. And whether you did or not is up to you, but you had the opportunity to vote and therefore the laws are binding on you, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't work that way in my mind. Like I didn't have the opportunity to kind of consent to that. Like the whole idea of consent, I think we need to talk about that term a lot more. I think it might resonate more with people on the left because if you have this ethic of consent, then what does it mean for a group of people to consent to something? Because I mean, even Frederick Bastiat, he writes about law can be, people can band together to create a law that's for common values because it would be more effective, or just out of their own desire, they want to do this to protect like their collective property or, to ensure each other, through some sort of like mutualism. And so I think there's room for that. But, I want to get your take on something because this is, I think, where I am in the questioning of what do we argue for? What is our rhetoric as libertarians or as anarchists? I would like a world, and I'll start it off this way. I believe that there's nothing the free market can't provide that's not better than the government. I think I said that logically right? So like any solution, it might be a little long time in coming, or it might take a little bit more to like evolve into like the better solution per se. But like, I don't think any top down solution is going to be better than a bottom up solution or a market-based solution. So coercion is never going to achieve a better outcome than freedom. So there's like three ways I just sort of put it. So we'll start with that. Yet at the same time, we don't have the opportunity right now. Okay. In the next 200 years, we might have the opportunity to colonize another planet or something like that, but that's still way far off and we're not even there. That's not even realistic to discuss. But so we don't have the opportunity to shape the world that we want. So you and I would like a world where people were completely non-coercive and they disavowed coercive means of law enforcement, right? Like that's what you probably would agree with. Mm-hmm. But that's not on the table. Like what's on the table is a little bit more or a little bit less immigration. What's on the table is, do we have Medicare for all? What's on the table is, and in terms of national conversation, I don't mean specific political things. Right. What we have on the table is thankfully legalization of at least marijuana. Okay. And so there's just all these like things that are like, they're now being discussed. And I want to get your take, like, what do we argue for? And I mean, I don't mean political agenda, but just the winning the hearts and minds aspect of things. Because you can win people's minds on, well, yeah, we should have this free society where, like in Capistan, right? We should have this free society, but like, we're not going to get there. You and I are really not going to see that. Right. Not at least in a nonviolent way. Like we might get there if there's like an apocalyptic scenario and now they're, like the survivors all happen to be preppers and also libertarian, and they decide out of, commitment to their ethics, they're not going to form a new state. But like, come on, like that's okay. Yeah, that's getting a little out there. But anyway, what do you think of my ramblings here?
No, I think that these are all good thoughts. Because you're right. I'm much more of a pessimist, where I don't think that any of the beliefs that I have are going to be fully realized and acted on And, even if I were to put a percentage on it, I'd say like even half of it, there are little things that are happening where we are seeing, like you mentioned, the legalization of marijuana, where we're seeing it seen all the way through in some situations where it's recreational rather than just medical and you have to have a license for it and things like that. Those are not fully realizing the liberty aspect in this one small conversation.
How many people have you heard, well, we should legalize it and that way we get more government revenue because it'll be taxed?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, no. That's not why we should legalize it. Right,
exactly. And that is where I like to stay in the conversation with, sticking with that, not getting into the pragmatic sense of where we can make things just a little bit better. Let's have a conversation on staying consistent to our ideals of liberty. And, I don't think that, we're going to see, like you said, we're not going to see Ancapistan. We're probably not even going to see that crazy, sci-fi moment that's going to, that could cause, like you said, like all your preppers, friends get together. We're not going to see probably any of that. But I do think it is still valuable to have that conversation with people and to, fully recognize our, commitment to being consistent with these ideas like liberty and freedom and non-aggression and all of those concepts that are kind of wrapped up into our terms like anarchism and liberty, libertarian.
Yeah, I think the word consistent is really important there. I mean, and I think what I hear you saying is like there are core principles that regardless of how far we'll get in the actuality of libertarianism, like a free society versus all the way, that could be, what we kind of reminisce about in the past where there were fewer tariffs and so forth, to like the Ancapistan stuff. Like there's a whole spectrum of what we could consider. Yeah, this is a pretty free society. How far we push that envelope is one thing, but the principles are still solid and kind of like our North Star, if you will, to talk a little bit about space travel somehow.
Yeah, I think that the likelihood of our ideals happening should not be what determines our ideals. It shouldn't determine,
drive us.
Yes, absolutely. What should drive us is that persistence, continuing to go toward being consistent with our ideals, with our ideal of, non-coercion and non-aggression, all of those things. I think that is what we should be constantly striving for, not striving for pragmatism and not striving for the lesser of two evils.
What are some of your favorite issues to talk about and to sort of advance when it comes to anarchism or libertarianism?
That's a good one. I guess it just depends. The other day I was at a barbecue and, just kind of had one of those unique moments where talking with someone who was not necessarily, wasn't of the same beliefs as myself when it comes to politics and stuff like that. But I had one of those unique moments where I got to really use some of those frustrations that all of us share with property taxes and different sorts of laws against victimless crimes and things like that. And being able to have a good conversation, not a yelling and screaming match, but having a good conversation about those things, about the consistencies in our liberty and Republican rhetoric, being able to show, are we actually striving for liberty? Are we actually talking about the same thing here? And I like those conversations a lot. Again, conversations, not arguments.
Yeah, right. Yeah. What would you go ahead if you were going to say something there.
Well, I was just going to add, I like those moments where someone is thinking about that and they've never thought about it before, because I was there once, and I listened to, Tom Woods, or I read a Rothbard book and I had that moment where it's like, oh, you know what? I haven't actually believed in liberty. If I was saying, oh yeah, we should only legalize marijuana a little bit and we should tax it and we should run the government off of, the taxes from it. Having those moments where someone sits back and says, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. I like those moments.
I think people do appreciate consistency when or even thoroughness, like seeking out, when they see people who have sort of consistent values and they have an opportunity to hear what those are, I think they're impressed, because I think a lot of, and again, I don't want to, claim this for everybody, but I think a lot of people have a lot of ad hoc beliefs about politics, and that it's not a consistent ethic.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely our side versus your side, right versus left. And it's built a lot on fear of the other side. And that goes for both sides. The right is afraid that the left is going to take their guns, and the left is afraid that the ice caps are going to melt. And, it's just, and it's always this intense fear that I think really drives a lot of it and makes people just so polarized.
Was that a pun on intentionally?
No, that was not.
My brain is wired. I'm a dad, and so dad jokes just spill out all the time. It's funny how it doesn't when I'm doing a podcast typically, because I think I don't know if we'd have more listeners or fewer listeners or not. But so one time when LCI had an executive treat, Norman Horn came and visited me, and we had a meetup in my area because Norman doesn't live near me. And we played this game. One of the attendees, Matt, suggested this as libertarians. And he said, all right, so we get to know each other. There was like 10 of us in the room. And he's like, what would be like the least libertarian thing that you hold to? Like, we would kick you off the island if we knew you believed. Mm-hmm. And, I had two. Outside of NASA, I'm okay with NASA, sort of. Like I do realize that, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk will probably, that would be sufficient. But anyway, but I have two. I'll let you go first, though. Do you have any beliefs that you're like privately, you're like, I'm okay that the government does this, or I'd be okay if they passed a law that X, Y, or Z?
No, I'd like to think that I'm completely consistent in everything, and I'm sure someone might be able to find somewhere where I'm not, but I really do operate in that the government should just be completely out of everything. And I'm talking even jump into the big ones like, defense. I think that it could be better handled with private organizations and, even defense, if we're talking just for your property and or kind of imagining these maybe larger communal sort of voluntarist areas, not communism or whatever, but where people are kind of banded together. And I think that some of those big ones that people are really scared about, with society just completely falling apart internally, or a threat from a foreign invasion, I really do think that all of that stuff can be handled privately.
Wow. Okay. So the next phase of that question was, well, if you don't have any beliefs, you're like totally, ideologically a purist, which sounds like you are. And I guess I figured I would be too, but like, are there any that, without being too personal, is there anything that you're actually guilty of? Like, do you happen to work for the state, or do you happen to accept subsidies just by virtue of your job or something? You don't have to, admit to either of those, but just like anything in your life, you're like, crap, I guess the state does support me a little tiny bit.
Yeah, I don't think that I have anything like that, but that actually is a good question, because I am in favor of, I think taxation is theft, right? And so if there's any sort of way that you can get that back, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with, accepting a tax rebate or something like that, which I'm sure someone considered, themselves even more ideologically pure than me, that they could point a finger at me, with that one. But, I understand that there are people, I've have friends that are of the same belief as me, but they take contracts with either city or state organizations. And it is the way that it is right now. So I don't like harp on them or anything like that. I don't think that would be beneficial at all to their life or our friendship. And I'm glad that I'm not actually in a position where I'm having to do those things. And maybe my opinion would change if I was. I don't know. But I'm not currently in a position where I need to do anything like that. And I don't really get on people's backs for, having to be a part of that. If they've already been part of a contract with the state or any sort of like government agency, and they see it through to the end, I'm not going to get on people about that.
Yeah, right. I think for me on that angle of like doing contract work with the government, it'd be like, well, is your whole business model based on getting government contracts and getting as much as you want? Or is it just so happen that what you do, the government needed you to do a project or something? Like there's kind of a varying degrees. But that's just speaking in the abstract.
A lot of it is in the abstract. And I would say that if you were already, an anarchist and you were going out and getting government contracts, well, yeah, that's not consistent, but, just someone who's a libertarian and might, hold some contracts like that, or might currently be within one when they, make that jump from, minarchist to anarchist or something like that. I'm not going to get onto them for seeing it through and then getting, and once they're done with that contract, never holding one again. Of course, that I think would be the better option.
Yeah. I think I would ban smoking. It's so crazy to me that I would actually say that. But I say that tongue in cheek, whereas, it's funny, like for many years, that was kind of my, like, I think that's the law I would hold on to. Like, so basically I see it this way. Like I live in Pennsylvania, and I remember as a kid when Maryland, which is where, I went to school in Maryland when I was younger. And I remember when they made a law where all restaurants could not be smoking. Like they couldn't have a smoking and non-smoking section anymore. I mean, I remember those days. Like, do you want smoking or non-smoking? And I, as an older kid, I remember that never happened in Maryland after a while. And I remember thinking like later, like, I think I'm okay with those laws because, I don't like them. And again, it's just like a little tiny thing. But if I were to institute something that everyone should have to follow, I would actually bring back like Sabbath laws. I think they would just be so good that like once everyone does them for a year, no one would ever complain again. Like, I say that very strongly. I'm if you saw me say this in person, I have a little twinkle in my eye and a smile on my face. But I'm just like, I think everyone just needs to slow down. There is just something about stopping. And I think that whole Sabbath principle is really in play. Now, no, I don't think literally we should do that. But those would be my two like vices, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand that. And of course, if we were really having a back and forth debate on that, I would go back to the same principles you've already said about, how the private sector can, do things better, and, we can better influence people through word of mouth or through publications rather than through legislation. And of course, because I'm the anarchist and, I can say that, laws against smoking, that violates private property, that violates, our libertarian principles. And for someone who also gets very frustrated with the blue laws, where I live, that is just, that is a pain.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, I'm just admitting some vulnerabilities here.
Yeah. No, and that's what makes it for a good conversation, though, is kind of looking at some of those things where we do appreciate some of these ideals that the state has then used its, heavy hands to enforce, and maybe we wouldn't want the state to enforce that, and try to have those conversations about how it can still happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've been running your podcast, the Anarcho-Christian Podcast, for quite a while now. And what's been the feedback you've gotten in the audience response for that?
It's all been very good, for the most part. I'm sure you doing, LCI and having the podcast and the website and Facebook pages that I'm sure you see your fair share of hate mail or any of those sorts of things. But for the most part, it's been very positive. Within our libertarian community, it's been mostly positive. Of course, you're going to have people that don't like the idea of the Christian aspect being associated with anarchism. You have your arguments, between left versus right still, even within anarchism, capitalism versus communism and that sort of thing. But for the most part, it's been great. The feedback from the website, feedback from the podcast, and the Facebook page and all that good stuff. It's been very good. It's been surprising, actually. I started this whole thing just a few years ago, and just kind of as a place to vent from, or just to throw out some ideas, because there's not a lot out there for Christian anarchism, and not expecting it to grow the way that it has, really.
Oh, that's really cool. I mean, I've appreciated your podcast, and I've heard you. I think you were on Mike Meharry's show as well, which is how I was introduced to you, actually. And then I went back and listened to some of your episodes, because I know Mike, and he's been on. We did a joint podcast about a year ago talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So that was fun. But I think I'm really glad to hear that that's worked well for you. I mean, social media is kind of, it's like a jungle. And it is sometimes, you get hate mail from like all sides. And, for LCI, we probably get the most like negative feedback from people. I think the way I would describe it is like people who think they're libertarians because they hold to a few core values, but they don't have and I'm not putting them down by saying this, but they don't have the consistent ethic going on. Like, so think more like the conservative warmongers who, you talked at very, very beginning of this conversation about, you had all the language there, like freedom and liberty and rights and property and all this other stuff. And they think that like, yes, exactly right. But if we don't have a strong national defense, then that's all gone. So we have to have a strong national defense and a big military, and we are the world's policemen, like it or not, and all this other stuff. Like, I think that's where we get the most reaction. Or the people who are, I've seen them called bordertarians. So, they're just kind of like, they don't use libertarian principles to describe, that. So anyway, we get it from that end. I mean, do you get more like hate mail from people who are more like left leaning or right leaning, or where does that come from for you? And hate mail could just be like negative feedback. I don't actually mean spewing hate mail.
Well, and I do get kind of a mix of it, if it's just comments on, the Facebook page, or comments on any of the content that we put out there, or, emails or whatever. I want to say for the most, it's probably mainly from what would be considered the right. I really don't care for the left versus right sort of thing.
Those labels aren't as helpful to you.
Yeah, but they do make sense, and I'm sure everyone listening, if I say that this came from the right or came from the left, I think instantly we have a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about. But I think like what you were just saying from the right, I'm a libertarian, or I believe in liberty and freedom, but but the defense, but if we legalize marijuana, then everyone's just going to turn into a drug addict, and stuff like that. I think that's a big one, something that we touch on a lot. And I don't know if this is going to be taboo for the show, but the pro-life aspect, that's a big conversation in Christianity. And that's one that, gets a lot of people
in Christianity.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
That's one that,
can you elaborate a little bit on that?
The pro-life thing?
Well, I know that it's a big conversation within Christianity.
It's a big conversation.
Yeah, that's slightly shocking that you said that as opposed to a big conversation in anarchism and libertarianism.
Yeah. So, and it is kind of difficult to after a couple of years of this, doing this Christian anarchism, kind of finding where some of the different voices are coming from that are, speaking against whatever message we're putting out there. But, as far as the kind of the right side is concerned, we have to have government legislation to end abortion. And then from the left side, it's typically the pro-choice aspect. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of Christian denominations or sub-denominations that are, completely in favor of pro-choice. That's probably not the loudest position. I would say that, pro-life is the loudest position within Christianity. But you'll get a lot of, a lot of different voices in that. And whenever we do post something about pro-life, we'll hear it from from all sides. And if someone says that, well, you're pro-life, and there's automatically this assumption that you mean that you want the government to completely control every aspect of it, and things are going to be fixed through legislation, which isn't that. It's just like we've talked about before with this. It's just getting back to that consistent moral position, and if we're talking, I guess, science and trying to understand when life begins, or if we're talking about libertarian philosophy of protecting life, liberty, and property, what exactly does that mean? And that one is I think very controversial and brings out a lot of emotion.
For LCI, we will post a lot of things on Facebook, and we've written a lot about this issue. And by we, I mean, like, we've had writers on here, and I'm about to put a plug in for something here in a moment. But the pushback that we get that are pro-choice are for people who aren't Christians, or like they stumble upon us, or they they like something else that we posted that might be anti-war. But, it's interesting. Like, I think that was why it was surprising me, is like, we don't get a whole lot of Christians who say, oh yeah, well, I think abortion is okay. Like there's like, I'm thinking of one who's in our Facebook group, and they are pro-choice, but for the most part, we don't get a lot from Christians who like defend the pro-choice stance. And I'm not sure if that's like, I don't really know what to attribute that to. That's interesting.
Yeah, there's a few denominations that I think are in general pro-choice. I think that there's even been a couple of recent splits within a few denominations recently. And I think the ELCA Lutherans, I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe is pretty open to that. I think that the Methodist Church has had some shakeups, dealing with that. And I think that there's a couple of more that they're escaping me, but it's definitely a conversation that's being held within Christianity right now. That at one point in time it was just a Christian versus secular conversation, but it's definitely in the church and making divisions right now.
Yeah, I mean, most of the leftist people that I have conversed with are sort of like reluctantly accepting that abortion needs to exist. Like, it's not like they think it should exist, but it's like, we lament that it has to exist as a procedure and that there are reasons for it. And of course, some people will abuse this, but I don't really hear them out too much on the argument. But yeah. So what I was going to plug a moment ago was Kerry Baldwin's debate against Walter Block. Did you get to see it? It was posted online recently.
I have not watched that yet. And I have heard Kerry's various podcast episodes that she's done and read some stuff she's written on it, but I haven't had a chance to watch that yet.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of being there during the debate itself, and it was really cool to see the amiable nature between them. And I mean, you wouldn't see it. Well, I don't even know if you'd see this in the video because Walter wasn't necessarily on camera when Kerry was making her arguments, but you could see him like furling his eyebrows and being like, thinking really hard about what she just said. And she was doing the same, but it's just really cool to see like somebody get up there like Kerry and just like make Walter Block stump a little bit, like it's just really cool. And I don't mean that in some sort of like pompous way. It's just like, it's really good to see somebody have a conversation at his level and get him to think and give her lots and lots of kudos. There was a point in the debate where like they were agreeing on so many things back and forth. And finally he was like, I guess I'm going to have to deprive you of the pleasure of agreeing with Miss Baldwin. on this next point because it was kind of a funny moment. But anyway, it's really, really good because I think it elevated the debate about abortion to something that libertarians can like dig a little deeper into when we talk about things and be consistent with them. And so that's my kind of memory of the debate is like, this is something worthy of like really watching again and kind of hearing the argument, because I think there was a whole lot of things that Carrie said that were ignored by Walter, not because he couldn't address it, but because it was so, you can't address everything. I mean, you have these debates are timed and, they're very structured and rigid. And so he couldn't debate everything, but like, man, I want to see them have a longer conversation. Maybe some podcaster will do that. Maybe we should do that. But yeah. So yeah, no, good conversations are really, really important. And if you have mutual respect, and that's sometimes tough to do because, you're sometimes having conversation with somebody you're just like thinks an idiot about whatever, immigration, war, Trump, whatever it might be. It's sometimes hard to have mutual respect for people, but if you treat them with mutual respect, you have a good conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as Christians, we should do that. That should be kind of in the forefront of going into any sort of conversation. And then also, I think I mentioned it earlier, but just keeping in mind that you might have come from that position before, so we don't want to make the mistake of getting to this completely consistent position and then just slamming everybody that has a different position. And when we do go into those conversations with respect and love, then I think that we're going to have those conversations where we can actually sway people, because you're not going to sway them by yelling at them on Facebook and stuff like that. It's not going to happen, But when you do go into the conversation, understanding where they're coming from, because you probably came from there too, and having that respect, then there's a good chance that maybe not that day, maybe not the next day, but later on down the road, they're going to be, going down that same journey that you went down, getting to that completely consistent position.
Stephen, I think that's a perfect place to end this conversation. Thanks for doing this. This has been like a real pleasure for me. This is a little longer than our normal episodes, but I'm really glad we got the time to do this.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I've been a big fan of your podcast. I appreciate you inviting me on here, and I hope we can do it again.
I'm sure we will.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I am very thankful to the Libertarian Christian Institute for having me on their show. If you're not currently subscribed to LCI, make sure you do that as soon as possible. We've shared several projects with each other over the years, and you may have recognized Doug's voice from our Mr. Machin Goes to Washington episode, in which Doug plays one of our characters in the radio drama that we put together for episode 72. I still feel indebted to Doug for lending his voice and time to that project. And while you're checking out the backlog, don't miss episode 51 with Dr. Norman Horn from LCI, as we discussed Ayn Rand and her influence on libertarianism, for better or worse. I will have links to both of those episodes in the show notes. And one last thing before I sign off. LCI has released a book this year that was co-written by Doug and Norm, as well as Carrie Baldwin and Dick Clark. It's called Faith Seeking Freedom: Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions. And if you've already read it, you will see my recommendation printed in the front of the book, along with some other names that you might recognize. But if you haven't heard of this book, I'll read my praise for it now. You can find a fair amount of Christian libertarian theory online today, and in no small contribution from the authors that have collaborated here. But there are a few options for comprehensive reading. Narrowing our options even further would be the expressed desire for something thoroughly covering the breadth of Christian libertarian philosophy, while remaining accessible for the beginner and worthwhile for the familiar. Faith-Seeking Freedom is an achieving apologetic. This catechism quickly surveys the vast subject while responsibly addressing necessary distinctions in expressing political theories that reside under the often umbrella terms of Christian and libertarian. I am thankful for the authoring and editing efforts that went into the creation of this book. It can easily serve to clarify terms and offer consistency to formed or forming convictions where our faith dictates our politics. I will have a link to where you can find Faith Seeking Freedom in the show notes, along with everything else I mentioned. While you're checking out all of those links, don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon or Subscribestar, or a one-time donation through PayPal. You can visit us on those sites, or you can visit the Support the Show tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to a page where you can find links to Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.